Please be seated. It is always a privilege and a pleasure to preach from this pulpit, and I am grateful for the opportunity. I have to warn you, however, that the title of the sermon is Remember Who's in Charge. I guess that just simply means we have to pray for the ones who are not in charge this morning with the title that was listed in your bulletin. Will you pray with me for just a moment? And now, Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. This is the sixth sermon in a series of sermons entitled Practical Christianity, and they're all based on the letter of James. Now, I think it's helpful for us to remind ourselves yet one more time about the context for the letter of James. James, of course, was the younger brother of Jesus, and James writes this letter to the church in Jerusalem at a time that the church is in serious trouble. It's now 30 years after the death and resurrection of Christ, and things aren't going so well. The social and the economic climate are deteriorating rapidly. And the people of that day expected the parousia, that is the second coming of Christ, to be an any-day sort of event. And now it's 30 years later, and they're having a hard time holding on to their faith. And so it's into this climate of controversy and challenge that James writes his letter to the early church. Now, the text which Exer read this morning starts off sort of like a Jonathan Edwards sermon. Now, Jonathan Edwards was an early 18th century preacher in Northampton, Massachusetts. He is known as sort of the father of the hellfire and brimstone movement. His most influential sermon, a sermon that all seminary students are required to read, is a sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And I had to wonder as I was preparing this sermon and I was reading and rereading this text from James, whether perhaps Reverend Edwards had studied this particular passage in some depth, because there's a little bit of harshness in the text this morning. James begins his letter to the church by saying, your prayers aren't being answered because they are bad prayers, focusing on yourselves and not on others. And then James calls them adulterers, although I prefer the Common English Bible translation as unfaithful ones rather than adulterers. But James keeps going. He says, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world is going to be an enemy of God. See, what James is doing is he's drawing a line in the sand. And he says, either you are a follower of God or you are a follower of the world. And then he goes on to say, if you're a follower of the secular world, there are going to be some pretty serious consequences. A harsh message indeed. In fact, James portrays these consequences that he goes on to talk about in language which sort of echoes the Beatitudes in reverse. Instead of saying blessed are, he says wretched are. Wretched are those who don't serve God because they serve the devil. Wretched are those whose hands are dirty because they're not clean. Wretched are those who serve themselves because they're not going to find happiness. Wretched are those who exalt themselves, for they're going to fail to feel happiness and satisfaction in their lifetime. Wretched are those who take the law and judgment into their own hands, because they're going to be stunned when they too are judged harshly. Now, I don't know about you, but when I go to Barnes & Noble to pick out a book to read in front of the fireplace on a cold fall evening this fall, I'm not going to go look for this particular theme. And surely the early church was less than flattered to receive this letter. And so we have to wonder aloud, why is it that James writes such a sharp letter to this church that's already struggling for survival? Why does he do it? Well, first and foremost, I think James wants the church of his day, and he wants the church of our day to remember who actually is in charge. See, the problem both then and now is that we fail to recognize that God is in charge. And when we fail to recognize that God is in charge, we begin to think about the fact that, well, maybe we are in charge. And what naturally follows the thinking about we being in charge is a whole slew of myths. For example, we begin with the myth that if we just work a little bit harder, if we just work some longer hours, if we just work smarter, then everything that we want in life is going to come our way. That's a myth. Or we begin to believe that if we point out the shortcomings of others, then we will be exalted in the eyes of the people that we want to impress. That's a myth too. Or we buy into the myth that simply having more and having newer and having more expensive stuff will fulfill all of our dreams. But here's the catch. Whatever it is that we believe, whether it's truth or whether it's myth, whatever it is that we believe begins to shape how we live out our lives each and every day. I think that Wall Street Journal writers Brian Burrow and John Hellier nailed a perfect illustration for this phenomenon when they wrote the book Barbarians at the Gate. Now, this book was about a leveraged buyout of the corporate giant RJR Nabisco. And the buyout was by a group of small investors, and the buyout was led by the company's CEO. And I think it's fair to say that fueled by enormous greed and unlimited self-confidence, this small group of people managed to buy a huge public company from their shareholders. And they were so proud of their accomplishment in doing this that they began to refer to themselves as masters of the universe. Masters of the universe. And now, some 25 years later, we can see some of the fruits of their labors as masters of the universe. And some of the fruits of those labors include the destruction of whole companies, the suffering of employees and employee families where people were laid off, and the devastation of whole cities that were left vacant in their wake. See, ultimately, this potent cocktail of greed and unbridled self-confidence provided fuel to the fire which ended up in the greatest economic meltdown in 75 years. Friends, do you hear the question that James is asking us in this difficult text? He says, friends, James is asking us how the we are in control thing is working for the church in Jerusalem, and how is the we are in control thing working for us today. He reminds us that no one really knows what tomorrow will bring. Are we not like a mist, he asks, seen one day and gone the next? Are we ever really in control at all? Well, I can tell you this. One of the most humbling aspects about being a pastor is the privilege that we get of experiencing your daily lives with you, experiencing your triumphs and your tragedies, experiencing the births of your children and your grandchildren and the deaths of your loved ones, walking with you on the journeys of your lives. We get to witness these events, and we get to witness how little control any of us has over any of these things. Should we not therefore acknowledge that God is the one who is truly in control? Should we not serve God with all of our heart? Should we not serve God with all of our mind? Should we not serve God with all of our soul? Should we not submit to what God is asking us to do rather than simply asking God to do what we would rather do? You see, if we truly recognize that God is the one who is in control, and if we truly submit to Him, then we don't have to worry about how things are going to turn out. We know how things are going to turn out. When we submit to God, James says, the devil flees from us. When we draw near to God, James says, God draws near to us. When we humble ourselves before God, James says, He will lift us up. And these are God's promises to us since the creation. Well, we all know that it's a lot easier to talk about this than to live this. I've got to tell you, I struggle with this control thing just about every day. I really want to be in control, or I think I want to be in control. I mean, I would love to be a traffic cop in Dunwoody for just one day. I would love to be at that corner of Nandina and Mount Vernon, because I think I could fund the entire city budget for a year by giving out tickets to those scofflaws who intend to commit vehicular homicide to humble pastors who are trying to go across the street and get a cup of coffee at Dunkin' Donuts. But when I read and reread this passage from James, all the air comes out of my balloon. For I most certainly am not the judge, and I most certainly am not in control, and I most certainly am not the one who decides what is right and what is just. God is. And I thank God for that, because I know that God also is a graceful God. And were God not a graceful God, then my rap sheet would be much too long for me to bear. Friends, the greatest challenges that we face in our lives come to us when we forget who is in charge. For whatever tragedy we face, whatever success we achieve, our satisfaction and our peace come from understanding that it is God who is in charge, and therefore we can see and feel His touch and His hand in our hand every step of our journey. One of my favorite stories in the Bible is the story of Joshua at the end of his life. You know the story. Joshua led the Israelites across the river into the land of milk and honey. He fulfilled God's calling. He helped the people to settle in their towns. He helped to settle their tribes. And yet at the end of Joshua's life, he finds that the people are rebelling against God. They want to go their own way. They want things the way they want things, in no other way. They want to be in charge, you might say. And so Joshua gathers all the people together, and he gives them one more passionate speech. He tells them and reminds them of all the things that God has done for them and through them. He reminds them of their covenant relationship with God. He tells them not to forget where they came from and how they came to get there. And then he finishes his speech with words which engaged his congregation that day, and I hope they will engage our congregation today. Joshua says to the people, "Choose today whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Friends, I believe this is our choice today. Whom do we believe is in charge? May we always remember, along with James and Joshua, that it is God and none other who is in charge. And may we today choose whom we will serve. May we declare with believers of all ages, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Amen and amen. It is our custom and our privilege as we wind down our worship service to ask if there are any